Today, we're ranking every major army of World War II, worst to best. And the twist is, the bottom of this list has almost nothing to do with courage. It's about who got handed a modern war with equipment from the last one.
Rank 15, worst, Denmark. Here's a number that sounds made up, but isn't. 6 hours. That's the entire length of Denmark's war against Germany on April 9, 1940, from the first border crossing to the government's ceasefire order that same morning, making it the shortest military campaign of the entire conflict. A handful of Danish border guards at the town of Bredevad actually did fight, and a few died holding a position nobody in Copenhagen had any intention of reinforcing. That's the part worth sitting with. This wasn't cowardice, it was arithmetic. Denmark's entire standing army numbered around 15,000 men facing a German force many times its size, with no mountains, no channel, no natural barrier to trade space for time the way Norway next door briefly could. The government chose to keep its cities intact and its civilians alive rather than stage a doomed defense for the history books. Denmark's army didn't get the chance to prove anything on a battlefield, but plenty of Danes proved something later, in a resistance movement that helped smuggle out most of the country's Jewish population right under the occupation's nose.
Rank 14, the Netherlands. If Denmark's war ended in a shrug, the Dutch armies ended in a threat nobody could ignore. Dutch troops actually fought, hard in places. At the Grebbeberg Ridge, poorly equipped Dutch infantry held a numerically superior German force for 3 straight days of close combat, longer than most military planners on either side expected. What broke the Netherlands wasn't the army losing in the field. It was a message delivered on May 14, 1940. Surrender, or the Luftwaffe flattens Rotterdam next. The government had already seen Rotterdam's city center reduced to rubble that same afternoon by a bombing raid that killed roughly 900 civilians. And with German bombers reportedly already airborne toward Utrecht, Dutch command chose to capitulate rather than let a second city burn. Some historians still debate whether that second raid was ever truly imminent or partly a bluff, but nobody making that call in The Hague on May 14th could afford to find out the hard way. This was an army pulled off the field not by defeat, but by an ultimatum aimed over its head at the people it was protecting.
Rank 13, Yugoslavia. What happens when an army's own uniform doesn't mean the same thing to everyone wearing it? That's the question that actually sank the Kingdom of Yugoslavia in April 1941, more than any German tank column did. On paper, this was a serious force, over 1 million men mobilized, enough manpower to make Berlin nervous. In practice, the Royal Yugoslav Army was built on top of a country barely 20 years old, stitching together Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, and others who didn't all agree the state was worth dying for. When the invasion came, entire Croatian units surrendered without firing a shot or defected outright. Some units mutinied against their own Serb-dominated officer corps, and Belgrade fell to a German assault within days after being heavily bombed. The whole campaign collapsed in 11 days, one of the fastest total army-scale defeats of the entire war, faster even than France. It's tempting to read that as weakness. It's more accurate to read it as a warning. No amount of manpower or equipment holds together an army built on top of a country that was never fully unified to begin with. And that's exactly the kind of self-inflicted collapse Romania's army, next up, never had the chance to suffer. Romania's men were still fighting for each other when the front gave way. Their army just wasn't the one their high command should have trusted to hold it.
Rank 12, Romania. Bold take to open with. Romania's army didn't lose Stalingrad. It got used to lose Stalingrad, on purpose, by its own ally. In November 1942, the Soviets didn't punch through the elite German 6th Army first. They punched through the Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies guarding its flanks, because Hitler had parked his weakest ally exactly where the front was thinnest and the anti-tank guns couldn't touch a T-34 head-on. 2 Romanian armies collapsed in under a week, and the encirclement that trapped 250,000 German soldiers only worked because someone else's soldiers broke first. Romanian troops fought hard earlier in Crimea. This isn't about cowardice. It's about a 1918-era army being asked to hold a 1942 front and taking the blame for a defeat that started with the man who put them there.
Rank 11, Hungary. If you think Romania got a bad deal, Hungary's was worse. An entire army sent to hold 200 kilometers of the Don River, with roughly 1 tank for every several kilometers of line. When the Soviets attacked at Voronezh in January 1943, The Hungarian Second Army stopped existing as a fighting force in about 2 weeks. Tens of thousands dead, tens of thousands more frozen or captured in a retreat with no winter gear. Here's the part that never makes it into documentaries. Hungary's government spent years afterward barely acknowledging what happened to those men, because admitting the scale of it meant admitting the war had never been winnable for them in the first place.
Rank 10. Italy. Everyone thinks they already know the Italian army. Comic, cowardly, ran from every fight. That reputation is mostly propaganda that outlived the war. Italian armor was genuinely awful. Crews called their own tanks self-propelled coffins, and mass surrenders in North Africa were real. But the Folgore parachute division held its line at El Alamein for days after the rest of the Axis front collapsed, fighting past the point retreat was even possible. And German officers who served beside Italian Alpine troops called them some of the most disciplined soldiers in the entire theater. The actual failure here wasn't the men. It was a fascist state that picked a war its factories couldn't support and left individual units to be brilliant or disastrous almost at random, depending on who happened to be leading them that week.
Rank 9, France. Here's a stat that breaks most people's assumptions. In May 1940, France had more tanks than Germany, and some French designs were better armored and better armed. France did not lose because its army was weak. It lost because that armor was scattered thin across the front, supporting infantry, instead of massed into an independent strike force the way German panzer divisions were. And because French command took days to even realize the real attack was coming through the impassable Ardennes. By the time anyone figured that out, German tanks were already across the Meuse. Individual French crews at Stone fought as well as anyone in that war. They were losing a doctrine war that had already been decided before a single shell landed.
Rank 8. Nationalist China. Here's a question worth sitting with. What does an army do when it can't win and can't quit? That's the position China's National Revolutionary Army held for 8 straight years against a Japanese military with total air superiority and far better logistics. Chinese forces absorbed casualties on a scale most Western coverage of this war never touches, and at battles like Changsha, they inflicted real, repeated defeats through pure defensive stubbornness. This army barely gets ranked in Western content because it fought a theater most documentaries skip, but tying down over 1 million Japanese troops for the entire war, troops that never became available for the Pacific, was one of the quietest strategic wins of the whole conflict. This army never had the gear to win outright. It won by refusing to disappear.
Rank 7. Imperial Japan. The popular image is suicidal fanatics with no tactical sense. Ask a Marine on Guadalcanal in 1942, and you'd get a very different answer. Genuine respect for night infiltration tactics and jungle discipline that ran circles around the Allies early on. Here's the actual, more interesting story. Japan's army was tactically brilliant in year 1, and then trapped by a command culture that treated retreat as dishonor long after retreat was the only sane call. That same rigidity kept commanders reinforcing hopeless positions on islands like Iwo Jima instead of conserving force for a war of attrition they were never structurally going to win. Brilliant tactics, catastrophic strategy, not fanaticism. That's the real Imperial Japanese Army. Rank 6. Poland. Forget the cartoon image of cavalry charging tanks. That's Italian war correspondent propaganda about a single skirmish, twisted into a symbol for the whole 1939 campaign. The real Polish army fought a 2-front war against Germany and, after September 17th, the Soviet Union too, a fight no army that size was built to survive, and it still held Warsaw under siege for weeks. Here's the bolder point most rankings miss entirely. Poland's real story isn't 1939. It's what came after. Polish pilots became some of the most effective squadrons in the Battle of Britain, and Polish troops under General Anders took Monte Cassino in one of the hardest single battles of the Italian campaign. An army erased from the map kept fighting under someone else's flag for the rest of the war.
Rank 5. Britain. The British Army of 1939 and the one that helped liberate Europe in 1944 are barely the same institution. Singapore's fall in 1942 remains one of the largest surrenders in British history, and the early desert campaigns exposed real coordination problems. What fixed it wasn't one dramatic turning point, it was unglamorous institutional grinding. Better combined arms training, an intelligence edge built around ultra-decrypts, and a logistics system that by D-Day could land and sustain an entire army group on a strict schedule across a hostile beach. Britain's real weapon by 1944 wasn't a better rifle. It was a system that had actually learned how to run a modern war. Rank 4, Finland. November 1939, the Soviet Union invades Finland, expecting it over in weeks. Instead, Finnish ski troops in temperatures that froze rifle bolts solid encircled entire Soviet divisions strung along forest roads never built for a modern advance. The destruction of the Soviet 44th Division at Suomussalmi is one of the most lopsided defeats the Red Army suffered all war. Finland lost territory in the end, and that's the part everyone remembers. Here's the part they shouldn't forget. A country smaller than metropolitan Moscow inflicted casualties several times its own losses, using terrain, mobility, and a defensive doctrine built for exactly the ground nobody else wanted to fight on. Few armies in this war did more with less. Rank 3, the Soviet Union. If this list stopped in 1941, the Red Army would be near the bottom. Stalin's purges had gutted its officer corps, and German encirclement swallowed entire armies whole, with millions taken prisoner in months. Here's the bold part. That's not the whole story, and judging the Red Army only on 1941 is exactly the mistake most rankings make. Between 41 and 43, the Soviets pulled off one of the fastest institutional rebuilds in military history. Officers promoted on competence instead of political loyalty. Entire factories relocated beyond the Urals to outproduce German industry in tanks by 1943. And a new doctrine of coordinated multi-front deep operations designed to shatter an enemy's entire depth at once. The endless human wave image describes 1941. It does not describe Operation Bagration in summer 1944, which destroyed an entire German army group in weeks. Judge an army by how it started, and the Soviets rank low. Judge it by how completely it rebuilt itself, and it belongs right here.
Rank 2, Germany. Here's the take that gets comments. Germany is not first on this list, and it's not close. Tactically, nobody disputes the Wehrmacht's excellence, the combined arms doctrine that shattered Poland and France in weeks, the small unit initiative that let junior officers out-improvise their enemies, brilliant defensive fighting even in full retreat. But roughly 3/4 of Wehrmacht transport, even at the height of Blitzkrieg, was horse-drawn, a detail the Panzer column footage never shows you. That's why a doctrine that could win a 6-week war against France could not sustain an invasion the size of the Soviet Union, and every brilliant German operation after 1942 was really a delay tactic against an outcome its own logistics had already made close to inevitable. Best trained army of the war tactically. Textbook case of tactical brilliance failing to fix a broken strategy. Everything else. Rank 1, the United States. In 1939, the U.S. Army ranked around 17th in the world in size, smaller than Romania's. 5 years later, it was fighting a 2-ocean war and running the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Here's the bold, unglamorous truth behind that jump. It wasn't better soldiers, and it wasn't secret tactical genius Soviet or German officers would have laughed at. It was logistics, solving the one problem that broke almost every other army on this list, which is keeping a mechanized force fed and fueled over enormous distances. The Red Ball Express truck convoys that kept Patton's tanks moving after Normandy weren't a footnote. They're the reason that breakout didn't stall the way Eastern Front offensives kept stalling once they outran their own supply lines. American units had rough tactical patches too, especially at Kasserine Pass in 1943. But an army that learns that lesson fast, retools mid-war, and still outproduces, outsupplies, and eventually outfights the most decorated tactical army in the conflict earns the top spot for a reason that has nothing to do with mythology. It never stopped being fed, fueled, and fighting 3,000 miles from home.
If you liked this video, I'm sure you'll like this one too. Subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Our channel is small, so we are replying every comment below.